This is one in the series of our big idea events, which expand and complement and open up debate on our programme. And this evening, we are asking the question, what constitutes real life? Are we really who we are in our physical bodies or in our imagination? And I'm delighted to welcome two people who I know are going to bring some fascinating perspectives to this. Jennifer Haley, who's played the Nether, or multi-award-winning play The Nether, receives its UK premiere this week in the Royal Court in a co-production with Headlong, and Anthony Beech, who is a professor in criminological psychology at the University of Birmingham. And Tony and Jennifer are going to be in conversation. And I want to come to you first, Jennifer, because I think that the title for this talk partly came from something that you said. So what I am, but of course, the question of real or virtual selves is at the heart of the Nether in so many ways. So why is it something that preoccupies you?
I think I've just always been fascinated by, because I've always had such a vivid imagination, even as a little girl. I remember when I would go to sleep at night, the way I would kind of put myself to sleep was, and I was always into fantasy novels and stuff like that. So I would become a character in a fantasy novel, and I was usually one of those little girls who was like masquerading as a little boy, you know, with the hair all cut off, and literally go on these long adventures in my own mind. So I think I've always been interested in the difference between, you know, who we are in reality and who we are in our imagination, where we want to go in our imagination, what we want to do, and who we want to be.
I must also remind everybody that you're really welcome to tweet about the event, #TheBigIdea, #TheNether. And we also have this extraordinary thing called the Nether Realm, which is in our foyer, and you'll have a big impact on that in a way that you can learn about later. But thank you.
And actually, then to kind of expand upon that, so now that the internet, and this was of course long before the internet, so you can always go off in stories or your imagination, but now you can literally create, there are places where you can create an identity, create who you are, present yourself a certain way, and literally go on adventures with other people who are interested in doing the same thing, who are interested in role play. So it's kind of fascinating.
That is brilliant, because the play really pushes that idea to the very furthest extreme in an extraordinary way. And we don't want to issue any spoilers, but there's just that's such an important philosophical inquiry in your play, and of course in your work, Tony. It's very potent, the idea of a real or virtual self and the impact of that self on the world. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess one of the strands of work I do is work with sex offenders, so we've been looking very extensively at internet sex offenders for quite a long while already. But just to roll back slightly, what you were saying about ourselves as human beings, what's interesting about us as human beings, we're the only creatures that don't live in the moment, as far as we know, isn't it? All other animals live in the moment, but we have a past which we tend to dwell on and ruminate about. We have a future which we're sort of planning and thinking about. Very different from many other species, as far as we know. Probably whales and elephants, probably have some of that. And with sex offenders, the work I do, a lot of their problems comes from the fact that they are dwelling upon the past. They are dwelling on what's happened to them. They are dwelling on terrible things that people have done to them, rapists, what women have done to them, etc., and what they're going to do in the future. And a lot of our work is very much about trying to get people back into the present, really. So this is a very different thing, this slipping that we can do between us now and us in our heads, really. Is that enough? I'll ramble on if you don't.
So, do you feel that this is something which is very much a question for now, for our times, because of the technology available to us? I mean, you talked about the world in your imagination, and that's something that we've always had, but obviously now there's a real manifestation in a virtual world of this sense of the imaginary self. And so it's about now, or have there been other times in human history, do you think, where it's been as potent as it is now?
I think people's ideas have shaped, Hitler had to come about and have this idea of what reality should be like, and 10 years later, look at what happened. So, and that was an idea that he shared through obviously not through the internet, but I don't think it's, the internet is interesting now, and it's people can share their ideas in these very specific ways and reach a global audience. You can put up a web page and people around the world can look at it. So I think it's about like, how do you spread memes? And the internet has really kind of made meme spreading much easier in a way. I mean, that's probably, in terms of the sex offenders, the online sex offenders, there are new avenues opened up by the internet that weren't there before.
I remember when the internet really came about, and I thought to myself, there's going to be a job for myself in the future, but not quite at that level. But I was just thinking about these levels of reality. I mean, one thing that I very much buy into is the notion of embodiment, that there isn't this Cartesian duality between the mind and the body. We are embodied beings. Our mind emerges from the interaction between, what's going on here and the environment, as you might expect. And I'm a great dabbler as well, so I'm going to go right off piece here and just say I've been interested in different therapies for a long while, and one therapy that I looked at a bit was something that's quite old, which is sort of shamanic drumming. Has anyone done shamanic drumming at all? You should try it. You can get a little cassette with the shamanic drumming on it, and you go into a sort of trance basically. And I kid you not, I went into this trance, and you're supposed to find a hole in the ground to which you can go into, and you go into a journey. And I had this really clear and very vivid experience of actually going to a hole in the ground and then getting into a boat. I only did this once, tried to do it again, it didn't work actually. But this was an altered sense of reality just through listening to drumming on a kind of cassette tape. So we can get into different levels of experience, I guess, and this is something Timothy Leary talked about as well. And I guess we can never predict what the future will be, but I mean, I guess that's some of the things that will happen in the future, really, isn't it?
Well, and Jung seemed to, I think, felt that dreams were just as, your dreams were a different form of reality, but they were just as real as anything that happened in the physical world. That imaginary space was its own reality.
And so your play is about a consequence, and one of the phrases that weaves through it is a life without consequence. And one of the characters says at one point, no one has been able to draw a connection between the virtual activity and the activity in the real world. And so that's something which, what's brilliant about the play is it leaves that open as a question ultimately, I feel, that is it something that you asked yourself when you were writing it?
Well, I want to ask Tony about it. But I know, for example, Grand Theft Auto came out, the new one came out a few months ago, and my brother was playing it, and I was playing it. I was laughing hysterically because I kept running these people over because I couldn't control the car. And it's interesting, because Grand Theft Auto, apparently you can hit dogs. They do draw the line at children. And I think there would be some real issues if they were, if there was different races involved, or if there was a racial aspect involved. But at this point, you can play Grand Theft Auto and run people over, and I won't even go into all the awful things you can do in that game. But as far as I know, there hasn't been an increased incidence in people hitting pedestrians and people going crazy behind their cars. And I don't think, even after one of the school shootings in the U.S., someone was blaming video games on the violence, and there was a study that came out in an article, and they really haven't been able to. They've done studies where they've had people play certain characters, and whether they're playing kind of good guys or bad guys, it can influence their whether they're nice to people or mean to people afterwards. That's very global generalization of the article. But the line in the play is there hasn't been a conclusive correlation between online activity and actual offense. As far as everything I've read so far is no one's been able to say that video games have created more crime, for example.
It's interesting to pick up on that. A colleague of mine has done a lot of work on violent video games, and that work's quite old now, but basically what you find from most young people it has no effect whatsoever. But for those ones that are already prone to that kind of violence, it does actually, well, it legitimises what they do if they're doing already, or it kind of increases. So for a small group, it definitely does cause an increase. I mean, I was on the British Board of Film Classification advisory board for about 10 years, and got to see some good films, got to see some terrible films. And it's kind of interesting, you know, the way that they did give certificates. And generally, I thought they got it about right, but now the 15 certificate is just, I'm looking at some of this stuff and I'm thinking this, psychologically, this is really problematic for some of these kids to see some of this stuff.
And I guess I would, if we can go there, I think you have done some studies and data about sex offenders and whether online activity influences offline activity.
Well, it's the sort of $1 million question at the moment. Are people who are downloading or looking at images of children, do they then cross over to commit hands-on offences? Well, it's terrible anyway that they are looking at stuff online, because that fuels that whole industry anyway. And, you know, some people will say everybody crosses over, some people will say, well, it's about 50%. We just don't know. But the people that look at this kind of material obviously have an interest. The actual crossing over to physical abuse, we reckon it's about 50%. But there's a new form of internet offender coming through who never want to meet their victims anyway. They're quite happy to groom their victims online, and sometimes there'll be the children upstairs being abused online on camera by an offender while the kind of parents are downstairs, and that's just a real sort of problem actually. And it's really increasing. So
I mean, the parents know.
Well, the parents don't know. When the parents do find out, sometimes the parents aren't that supportive, you know, of the children. But the children, you know, you get children who take risks online, then they do silly things, then they start being blackmailed, and more things kind of happen. But there's never any intent, a lot of these guys, to actually then formally meet the victim. They get their, you know, they get their pleasure just from sitting at their computer while these children actually do stuff.
Like the power of control.
Yeah. And I guess the question is it a safer environment if we have really good virtual realities? Is that something that's safe for those people to do? You know, to do that with an avatar? Well, I would suggest not actually, because if people start doing these things, then they certainly want to do these kind of things in real life quite often. I'm talking too much.
No.
So, obviously, your field of expertise is in the area of child abuse, and that certainly is one of the themes of the play. But I suppose the bigger question of the play is the idea of the id and the self that can be created, and all of us have, in various different kinds of ways, I suppose, desires which we may want to explore and act out, not necessarily sexual in any way at all. I mean, I'm sure lots of people in this room have avatars and role-play games which they engage with. And I suppose, what is this technology enabling us to do in our imaginations? Is it allowing us to go to places where we've never been before? And what does that mean for us? Neurologically, maybe, in terms of neuroscience. What do you
want me to carry on that?
Well, what do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah.
I don't yet know. I don't know. I'm sure there are all kinds of, I mean, I find out things that are going on online. I'm like, oh God, you know, like I actually don't spend that much time going down those avenues. But I think even with, well, it's sort of crazy, this thing with Tinder, you know, like Grindr and Tinder. You've probably heard about these apps where you just swipe through a few photos to be texting someone, meeting them 20 minutes later, and there's all kinds of, I don't know what to think about that. I mean, I wrote this play, but it really was an exercise of the once again, an exercise of the imagination and taking these things to their extremes. And I don't feel like I have any hard answers, like this is right, this is wrong, we should do this, we should do that, because I don't know.
I think that in order to write a play, and I know that Simon Stevens has articulated, that you need to not know the answer to a question. If you know the answer to a question, you don't need to write the play.
That's very interesting.
Tony, do you want to talk a bit more about
Well,
that.
yeah, I don't want to give too much of the game away about your play really, but there's some aspects of it that I really liked, was the fact that people were imagining also really nice things as well, nice things that they didn't actually have in the real world, and I thought that was interesting. But at the moment we do have a very nice real world, don't we? We have a far nicer real world than we probably have a virtual world at this moment in time, and we mustn't forget that. And we should encourage people sometimes to get out and about a bit more, don't we? But I mean, in terms of trying to predict the future though, we were talking earlier on about some science fiction stuff like this, and we were also talking about, I'd reread an Isaac Asimov book which was written in 1951, where he predicted loads of things like spaceships that went, really, really fast, faster than the speed of light. And they needed to do this because they needed to deliver people's letters. And so he didn't predict email, basically, and I guess we never can, but maybe the prediction is there will be some sort of interaction between our bodies, as William Gibson says, and a virtual reality that you can jack into. And that's sort of, I say I'm not saying too much about it.
Well, it's also, it should be, the thing is, it's hard to tell what direction it could take, because as the generations, I think virtual reality is around the corner. I don't think that's a science fiction type prospect at all. I'm not quite sure what form it will take. I think to get a full-on sensory experience, I imagine it would require some kind of brain chip or something. But I know they're already using brain implants to help people with extreme depression, and they've had some really good results from that. I read an article about a woman who was part of the study with the brain implant, and she had this kind of great outward life. She had a job. She had it was either a niece or a grandchild, and she was so distraught because she would hold this child in her arms, and she couldn't feel emotional about it. She was so down in this depression. So she got to be part of this study and had this brain implant inserted, and I forget how it worked, but it was in a very specific part of her brain, and I think it was probably, it was activating a part of her brain with electric signals, and she felt relief almost instantly. Like when they put it in, she felt relief almost instantly. They put it in and they activated it, and she imagined this child, and suddenly she was filled with the feelings of love that she had wanted to feel, and the depression lifted to a great degree. She continued with it somewhat, but this brain implant had a real effect on her emotions, and that's kind of like, well, that's a success story, but then what's the flip side of that? And then it totally invites questions of who we are, and are we just cells, and are we just electronic responses, and yes, I know, go on and on and on.
That is an extraordinary idea. Could you write another play about that? That's your next play. That would be, it's mind-blowing, the idea of a chip in the brain that can have that much of an impact on the emotional.
And would people do it, or would they be like, no, this is ridiculous, or would it even have to be in the brain?
Yeah.
What if it could be in your arm, or and I think you can go down kind of the, if you're telling a story, you can go down kind of the obvious route. If you have a brain chip and people hack into it and you become a robot, and but I just think that the psychological and emotional stories around what that could entail are much more fascinating and much grayer.
We're going to talk about the brain. Can I give you a model of the brain?
Yes.
This is my model of the brain, which is my arm. This is your spinal column, my arm. And at the top of your spinal column, you get something called a brainstem. That's the bit that keeps you alive, keeps you breathing, etc. In a word, that's all there is. As you get higher up the phylogenetic scale, you get to the midbrain. That's my thumb. That's where the emotions are. There's something called the amygdala in there. Can people come across the amygdala? It's a bit that keeps you alive. If you were walking down a sort of path in the jungle and something black came across, you'd freeze or you'd run away. The amygdala's looking for threat in the environment all the time. Okay, so that folds in there, and that's all the emotional stuff is in my thumb, and then you've got the cortical stuff kind of just folds over. That's my fingers, and so virtual reality, I think, is going to be very much at the cortical level, isn't it? And our kind of processing about hearing, seeing, thinking, etc. But getting to this bit where my thumb is, where the emotional stuff, that's going to be interesting, basically. Yeah.
So I wonder, do you think, obviously we don't have the article here in front of us, do you think that they were plugging into her, into the deeper?
Yeah, into the deeper, definitely into the deeper levels. Yeah. I mean, there's various bits to do with emotion. There's something called the insula, which is a tiny bit up here, which is to do with different emotions. There's something called the anterior cingulate cortex, which tells what is real and what is kind of imaginary, and maybe that's a bit which is interesting, isn't it? Because for some people who are very traumatized, that's not working terribly well. They can't tell what is real for now and what is a traumatic memory, basically. So all these bits we'll be stimulating at some point in the future. Already we do something called transcranial stimulation, actually. And they've also worked with rats, stimulating their pleasure centres, and these rats will pleasure themselves to death, basically, because they'll just keep, they won't eat, they'll just keep hitting this bit, which is the kind of pleasure. Yeah, exactly. Exactly, yeah.
People returning to the hideaway again and again,
Yeah.
coming back into the world. That's brilliant. Shall we take a couple of questions from the audience? Would you like to ask Jennifer or Tony some questions about? And I know many of you are going to see the play, but you might want to ask something to do with the play or something a bit broader to do with the subject.
I'm convinced that the mind is an evolutionary product of the body, or, as I believe actually, that the body has come as a consequence of the creation of the mind. Is that correct?
It started with the mind?
So is the mind an evolutionary consequence of the body?
It's a product of our minds. Because the basic medical belief is the other way around.
Right.
That the body creates the mind, and when the body breaks down, the mind is fucked. Okay.
Well,
that's really pertinent, isn't it, too?
One of the characters in the play is proposing that the internet itself and the ability to communicate with other beings without the barrier of geography is just another aspect of consciousness wanting to know itself, and consciousness wanting to know itself through communication of beings that are trying to shed their physical selves and shed the barriers that physicality brings up.
It's all about emergent properties, actually. You get emergent properties in ants, for example. Ants are pretty primitive beings, but ants together, to the high level of organisation, they do amazing things. And there's an ant colony, and what our brains basically are is an emergent property of all those different neurons firing. And what some people have talked about, that you might get emergent property at a higher level, really, across computers at some point. When you start connecting loads of computers, you will get some sort of emergence, basically. Why we have consciousness, I firmly believe, is due to something called our spindle neurons. We have 20,000 of those and very few animals have them. There's us, the toothed whales and the African and Indian elephants, and they seem to pull lots of different bits of our brain together. And you can certainly clearly see consciousness, can't you, in elephants and also whales. So that's, it's an evolutionary thing, really, that we have this emergence of consciousness. Some people say it's just 5,000 years old. There's a guy, I can't remember his name actually, says if you look at Homer, that was called the pre-camel mind or something.
Julian James.
Julian James, the very person, yeah. Who was saying that if you look at Homer, for example, that where Homer's characters, the gods speak to them, that's because the right hemisphere is sort of speaking to them. I've got that right, isn't that?
It's what the origins of consciousness to break down the black camel.
Yeah, exactly, the breakdown of black camel mind. I don't know if I go further with that, I can tell you where it's interesting.
I guess it invites the question of, okay, well, if this is the way it's emerging.
Yeah.
First of all, is that the natural evolutionary track? If there are other, if there is life in other parts of the universe, has, I'm sure things look differently, but is consciousness something that the universe is inherently, if all of the life-supporting systems are intact, is this the way it always unfolds? And if so, why? And I don't know.
I think the why is an interesting question. I think it's just somehow that there is this push for complexity actually all the time. But so I'm going to come out with a quote. So forgive me for anybody who's deeply religious here, but one of the Huxleys was talking about, someone asked about whether God existed. And there's a fantastic quote from Huxley. He said, all I can say, if God exists, he had an inordinate fondness for beetles, because half of all species that are on this planet are beetles. So, and they find a new beetle species about every 23 minutes. So if God existed, he must have been making an awful lot of different beetle species. But I think, on a more serious note, I think there is a push, and that's why we have these notions of God as well, isn't it? Because the notions of sort of complexity, isn't it? Pushing for complexity. We certainly is the most complex being that there is, aren't we, at the moment? Very noble.
And God and creation are such important ideas in the play as well, aren't they? As you will come to see in a short while.
Yes, great play, must see.
Do you have some more questions? Yes, thank you. We've got some microphones here, so you can wait for the microphone and then we'd love to hear it. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I was just interested in the nature versus nurture element with the sex offenders that you work with and everything, and with everything that you were mentioning about if you think they do what they do because of lack of biological things in their brain, and like this story you were talking about, that lady, she had a chip inserted and then that changed the way, or do you think it's more nurture, just as somebody who is working?
Is that for me?
I think that's for you.
That's for me. I'm very interested in risk factors for offending. And if you look at a lot of offenders, not just sex offenders, they've had pretty dreadful lives, they've been pretty traumatised. There's been even things like maternal smoking in the womb, drinking in the womb can have really big effects upon the embryo. So people come out, it's not necessarily a genetic thing, but people come pre-prepared not to function at a very good level. They're pretty impulsive, they're looking for, sometimes they're looking for emotion or stuff from other people, but they're afraid to get into relationships, so they might offend against children, for example, or they're very hostile and angry towards women, so they'll commit sexual offences. So I think it's a lot to do with the things that have actually happened to people in their lives, is where they come from. But if things happen to you in your life, then genes start getting switched on and off, basically, and that can be very problematic for you, really. So that's my take on it. It's a nurture thing, really, but having an effect upon your brain.
Do you have a take on that, Jennifer?
It seems that there's a piece that was just done on This American Life on NPR. It's called Tarred and Feathered, and it's fascinating. It's about they don't go into his past, so they don't say definitely that he wasn't abused as a child, but he is 19 when he does the interview, and his voice has been changed, and he talks about how during puberty, he realized that he was only attracted to, he started getting into child porn on the internet and realized that this was his proclivity. And then this went on for about 2 or 3 years, and then he saw an image that was particularly distasteful, and he suddenly thought, maybe this is wrong. And then there was this long period of actually trying to find someone who he could talk to about it, because most, according to this piece, most psychotherapists don't want to take on pedophiles. And if a pedophile mentions anything about, or pedophile, child pornographer, I'm not quite sure what the exact terminology would be. He had never committed an offense other than looking at the child porn. There was no child involved, but if there had been and he tried to go to a psychotherapist, that therapist would have had to immediately go to the police. So this piece goes into the fact that sex offender or people attracted to child pornography have a very hard time actually being able to talk about it with anyone. And it was interesting hearing this young man discuss it, because he was very definitive that from the moment he was aware of his own sexuality, he knew exactly what he was and was not attracted to, and he said that he felt pretty sure that no one was going to be able to convince him to be attracted to adults. That's just not the way he felt like he worked. He simply could not imagine it.
It's kind of interesting about sexual attraction, because I work with a neurochemist, and sexual attraction seems to be laid down typically a couple of years before puberty, and it's in men certainly, and it's due to estrogen, which seems to lay down what you're attracted to. I mean, I've had many conversations with a lot of paedophilic priests actually, in treatment, and they will typically say, yeah, I started being attracted to boys when I was 10 or 11 years old, typically a couple of years before puberty. Luckily in the UK we have big treatment programs. We treat probably 1,000 guys in prison a year, sex offenders, and probably even more in the community, but that's very much kind of cognitive behavioural stuff really.
And have you you have any examples of people who've been attracted to children who were able to, whether it was an issue of nature or nurture, this is where their sexuality was aligned, that they were able to switch that or change that? Not really, no. I mean, for the ones that are, a lot of people abuse children. The great majority aren't what you would call paedophiles. Probably 2/3 are if we talk about men, and men who are attracted to post-pubescent children. There's a wonderful machine called the penile plethysmograph. Have you ever come across that? In which you you actually attach a man's penis to a strain gauge, and in the old days used to show different aged children and see what people got aroused to. A non-offending male, rugby playing men or American football, I think they looked at them, will be attracted to adult women generally, but they'll be attracted to pubescent girls as well, because biologically you have children with them. So you've got to make that distinction between the ones that are paedophilic, and that's very, very difficult to change that really, and guys that are attracted to underage girls really, who are the great majority of sex offenders, who are offended against typically girls in their own families, stepchildren or children, for example. And you're saying girls who are, like around what age?
Well, underage, I mean it's different in different countries, but I mean it would be 13 to 16 basically. Right,
because there's a difference between those who are attracted to prepubescent.
Yeah. And prepubescent ones will typically have if you use the PPG on these guys, they will have no attraction to post-pubescent individuals at all, so that is their primary attraction, and they're stuck with that. And what we try and do is say, you've got to handle this, you've got a problem with this for the rest of your life, and you've got to handle it. I mean, in some countries you have chemical castration, that's a thing, and even physical castration in places like Poland, and some people actually elect to be physically castrated.
So that they won't offend?
Yeah. Still can though. Again, it comes back to a lot of it is in people's heads, so.
But I think we talked about this a little bit in the hallway. You don't necessarily feel like, and I'm certainly not proposing this in the play, it's a proposal by a couple of the characters in the play, that if you have this predilection, there should be a place online where you can live it out, as long as you're living it out with other adults who are interested in the same thing. But I think you were saying that you think this does create it legitimizes it in a way, or lets them tell each other this is okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is the argument for people looking at online child pornography, saying, well, they won't look at, they won't go do anything in the real world, but obviously quite a few people do. I mean, I've done quite a lot with looking at treatment programs, and I did one fairly big study looking at people who'd committed sexual murder. And there again, there've been tryouts, and what they wanted to do was, some individuals who really fantasized about this, they wanted to do this murder in a particular way. And if it didn't come out just how they liked it, they would do it again. Now, I guess thinking through this virtually, you're never going to get the level of arousal and emotion I would assume that you would get in the real world, that you would actually get on the internet, unless you can get into the that midbrain bit again. It might be different then. I'm still not saying it's a good idea. It's interesting. I mean, I had a conversation with one woman who works in the States, and she dealt with a lot of psychopathic sexual murders, and they were talking about this amazing buzz they actually got when they actually committed the offence, really. But again, that stuff is coming from very much from the midbrain, really, for all the emotional stuff.
I don't know if you all are familiar with the story of the cannibal cop in New York, but this is a very interesting case that came out when we were working on the play a year ago in Los Angeles. And it's about a member of the New York Police Department. His wife saw online, I think she saw some creepy emails, and she installed spyware on his computer, and then found out that he was going into these chat rooms and having these awful conversations with other people interested in the same fetish, in which he was imagining her and a host of other women they knew and planning on kidnapping them and boiling them and all this. It was the level of stuff he was imagining was horrific. He also had searches on the computer for rope and homemade chloroform, and she turned all this in, and they arrested him. And initially, they did convict him for, basically saying that he was going to commit these crimes. But it came up in the trial that he had never, even though he'd been discussing these women with other people in these chat rooms, he'd never given anyone their last names. He'd never given anyone their addresses. His biggest offense was he did use the police database to find out more about some of these women. But he had, in fact, some of them had solicited addresses from him and last names, and he had not given them to him. And in his chat room profile, it said underneath his profile, everything I say here is purely imaginary, it's purely for purposes of fantasy. So the jury was horrified. They wanted to throw the book at him, and he got convicted, and he could have faced life in prison. But then a judge, I think, really knocked down the sentence. It went on to another, appeal, and this judge found that because he had not there was just simply no evidence that he was actually going to do any of this, that they couldn't throw him in jail for life. But and one of the women he fantasized about actually was a friend of his, and she got on the stand in his defense and said, "I know he would never do that."
Right. Well, it's just all about the kind of the moral limits of the subconscious, and our understanding in the way that the play explores that, about how do you police the subconscious, and can you? And also in the sense, the way that policeman was writing a fiction of himself on social media platforms. I mean, people might be tweeting now, we're all kind of creating a fiction of ourselves in a way. Is that an imaginary self that we all create all the time? It's not, is it really ourselves, or is it just an imagined version of ourselves that we want to project for whatever reason into the world? But perhaps not as an extreme as that.
Well, there is policing the mind. It's something that's happening with sex offenders now. There is a kind of mandatory polygraph. Lie detectors. There was a big study that looked at people being polygraphed regularly, just to see if they were starting to get towards doing dodgy things, basically. And so these guys would troop along, every week or every fortnight and be polygraphed. And the idea was that people wouldn't drift towards even thinking about doing stuff. So there is a policing before you even actually get to a crime.
It's fascinating.
All I can say is I've worked with offenders for 20 odd years, and I'm far less liberal than I used to be. So I see nothing wrong with things like that, but I'll probably be howled down now.
Wow, let's take a couple more questions before we finish. Do you have some more questions from the audience? Yes.
Do you think some people have a propensity to...
Sorry.
Do you think some people have a natural propensity to fantasize more than others? Some people.
Yeah. Yes. We have a questionnaire. We have a sort of, it's called the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, which is about kind of emotions actually, and it's got a little subscale about fantasy, you know, can you put yourself in the place of another person? And some people are very good at that. Some people, you know, have a very rich fantasy life. Some people, like myself, have a very poor one. Yeah, it's just on a normal distribution. Some people are very, very good. And obviously, a lot of you know, people in the arts have got an amazing, you know, ability to think, haven't they? I mean, Shakespeare, for example, at 4th or 5th level of being able to put himself in other people's shoes, isn't it? If you've got a Shakespeare play, there's a play within a play, and then someone is someone else within that, you know, and that's a pretty abstract, high level of fantasising. Give me that from all about this.
So is there a distinction between ambition, like people in sport have, seeing themselves as winners, and kind of fantasy which is unacceptable?
What is the question?
I'm wondering whether there's a line between fantasy which is kind of unacceptable and visualization of being the best at something.
What do you mean in terms of fantasy being unacceptable? Like a certain kind of fantasy?
Well, the kind of thing that you've been talking about.
So like the offensive fantasy, basically something you would not be able to do in real life.
Yeah.
But the difference between that and a like visualization, basically,
Yeah.
is there a line in terms of what we should be
Yeah.
able to visualize?
Is it all part of the same thing, or is there something completely different?
Well, visualisation in sport quite often is about things like muscle memory and stuff like that, it's being good at something, and that's very much to do with the cerebellum, which is the bit at the back which makes you good at these kind of activities. In certainly sex offender treatment, they do talk about good fantasies and bad fantasies. A good fantasy is having sex with an appropriate partner who's willing to engage in that sex. A bad fantasy is forcing yourself on someone, and where there's a power imbalance, basically. So yeah, there is a good fantasy and bad fantasy. Yeah. So they say in the treatment program.
Thank you. And that is actually 7 o'clock, so I am going to have to wrap up the talk there. I'd like to say thank you so much to Tony Beech and Jennifer Haley for joining us this evening for the big idea, and also thank you very much to Alex Partners who sponsor it and make it all possible. Thank you.